Hello there, and welcome to Explain Apologetics. I'm Samuel Nason, and today we have a very exciting guest with us to discuss the topic, the historicity of the book of Exodus. A few months ago, I was debating with atheist debater Tom Jump on a mock debate on Explain Apologetics. You can find that if you scroll down to our debate playlist. And in concluding from the debate, Tom Jump and I were talking about the nature of evidences for the historicity of Moses. Was that just a made-up story? To answer those questions, we have the privilege of having Dr. Mark Janzen with us today. Let me really briefly introduce him for those of you who are new to him. Well, he is a former professor at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He was assistant professor of history and archaeology here from 2015 to 2019. He's also received his MA from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Biblical and Near Eastern Archaeology, and also his PhD from the University of Memphis on iconography of humiliation, the depiction and treatment of foreign captives in New Kingdom Egypt. His minor is on Judaic studies and Egyptian art and archaeology. So with all those big words, you bet he knows a lot about the topic that we're going to be discussing today. It's a joy and privilege to have you with us, Dr. Janzen.
Well, thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. Well, as you heard, we've commonly encountered questions on the historicity of Exodus, particularly coming from the atheists, because there are lots of other people that might be okay with just having Christians believe that in the Bible. Muslims, of course, believe in the historicity of Moses. Buddhists and Hindus, this is not a big issue for them at all, but mainly when dealing with skeptics here. And I guess what I'll begin by asking you before even getting to that is you could just briefly share with us, I'll briefly introduce you, share with us what you're currently working on right now and what we can expect of you even before we start talking about the evidence itself.
Yeah, so currently I have a couple book projects that I think your viewers will be interested in. The first is called The 5 Views on the Exodus, where I'm the compiler, the editor, whatever you want to call it, and I bring together 5 different scholars with very different views on the Exodus to share their views. Each chapter then has their view, and then the other 4 contributors respond to it before the original author for that chapter then has the final say, and we move on to the next view. So that'll be, I hope, a great resource for people who are interested in learning more about the Exodus and understanding sort of the host of issues in a very complex topic, but also trying to write it in a way that is not just for academics. And so that'll be actually out with Zondervan in April of 2021. So it's coming in along quickly here. My next book is something I'm co-authoring with Chris McKinney, and that is on the route of the Exodus. And that will be out later this year, I hope, but we're working on it as we speak. And so that one is a really a sort of step-by-step analysis of the itineraries that the Israelites traveled on their way out of Egypt, ultimately before they entered the Promised Land. So we're looking at the Exodus and Numbers itineraries both, and that's going to be hopefully another really useful resource for people. And then I have an overall epigraphy project in Egypt on the wars of Merneptah, his battle scenes that he displayed on one particular wall at Karnak Temple. And Merneptah is most famous, I think, probably for his being the first extra-biblical mention of Israel in the hieroglyphs in one of his stela. That's not on my wall, but it is the same pharaoh. And so what we're doing there is more of an Egyptology project, not an Exodus project, but it is a very important pharaoh. So,
well, that's absolutely great, and so we're going to be, of course, for those of you who are interested in getting those books, as soon as those books come out, you can expect to find links to those on our Facebook page, Explain Apologetics, and to just get into the discussion itself. Maybe let's start out with an introductory question for those who are just new to biblical archaeology and particularly the book of Exodus. How should one approach the evidence? When we're speaking about archaeological evidence here, especially with regards to the book of Exodus, how should one go about doing that? And what are some questions that we should not be asking when we get into biblical archaeology?
This coin, of course, the first is to read the Bible carefully, which seems like a sort of, well, duh. But I do find that people kind of run around and they proof text and they want the Bible to answer questions that it's not that interested in, like who was Pharaoh. And I think we can make a case for Pharaoh, who the Pharaoh was, but it's really telling that the Bible doesn't actually give us that information. The Bible's interest is more so who is God and what is he up to. And so I just think we should keep those kind of things in mind. That's a fairly simple, straightforward point. And then maybe more particular to our conversation today is we need to understand the limitations and the nature of archaeological and even historical evidence and make sure we ask it to answer the right kinds of questions. So I think sometimes people think that archaeology can do things that are really, really precise, and occasionally we get that, but it's pretty rare. So for Moses, I mean, what would proof to a skeptic that Moses existed look like? Is it Moses was here on a rock? I mean, was that the right Moses? That's a common name. I can hear the objections now if we were to find that. It's a forgery, right? I think we have to make sure we understand that archaeological evidence is usually good at bigger patterns, not so much little specifics. And how would you prove the details of the text? If I could give you an example from David, I think that illustrates it even better. So, of course, much of the historical books, First and Second Samuel involve King David, of course. He writes a number of the Psalms. For Christians, there's no dispute that he's historical. And for archaeologists, this was a debated topic. I suppose it still is amongst a few sort of outliers. But then in 1993 at Tel Dan, they found what we call the Tel Dan Stela because we're super creative. And this is a text that mentions House of David, written by an Aramean king who's an enemy of Israel and Judah about 100 years after David's reign. And this is really interesting because he says House of David just like we would say House of Windsor, right? For like British monarchs or Tudor or whatever to pick a period. So he's saying David existed and founded a dynasty according to an enemy, right? That's about as good as it gets for specific proof from archaeology and from a historical text that a biblical character of such importance existed, but it is still very limited. Does it tell us how long he reigned? No. Does it tell us anything about him fighting Goliath? Or is it fair with Bathsheba, right? We have to be very careful that we let the evidence speak for itself and don't try to pile things on top of it. And so when it comes to archaeology and the Exodus, there's this sort of idea that people have that, oh, well, there should be evidence all over Sinai or something. But it's not really been excavated. Sinai Peninsula has had surveys, which is just someone walking around and seeing if there's any pottery, basically. And that's not the same as an actual layer by layer excavation. And that just simply hasn't taken place. So the thing here is we want to make sure we don't just argue from silence or talk about negative proof, which is what a lot of skeptics do. So like, there's no proof doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means we don't have data, right? It's one of my favorite scholars, Kenneth Kitchen, puts it this way. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And I think that's an important kind of maxim for us to keep in mind.
Oh, absolutely. That's really helpful. That, the argument from silence that just because there's a lack of evidence doesn't necessarily mean that the events surrounding the book of Exodus didn't happen. But I guess we were talking about how atheists should be approaching it and what questions they should be asking about it. Let's maybe take this from the perspective of an atheist who is asking the question. What should they be looking for if they're approaching this from a purely empirical point of view to validate the historicity of the book of Exodus? What should they be looking for? And maybe a follow-up question to that is, what would they find?
Okay, so I would actually say this to atheists, skeptics, Christians, everybody. But first of all, I think the best place to start is when you're talking about the composition of the text and the old idea that it's written, J, E, P, and D and documentary hypothesis, and most of it's made up later, then the question would be, why are there so many authentic New Kingdom Egyptian-isms, for lack of a better term for it, in the Exodus? If they're never there, how do they have so much authentic data about Egypt? That's the first place. And curious viewers could read Jim Hoffmeier's books, Israel and Egypt and Israel and Sinai, for the full amazing treatment of this. He's a mentor of mine. I studied under him at Trinity, but his books are, he's the guy who wrote the book on this stuff. And he basically asked a simple question. Instead of looking for Moses in Egypt, what if I looked for Egypt in the Pentateuch? right? Because if they wrote it all way later, even as far as the exile in Babylon, why do they know all these Egyptian terms? So there must be some kernel of memory accurately carried on, or they wrote it quickly after, right? So either way, I think we're on good standing. So for example, there's a cluster of Egyptian loanwords in the Hebrew, like words that are definitely Egyptian. In the story of Moses' birth and being placed in the basket, in the rushes, in the river, there's like 6 words in like 2 or 3 verses that are Egyptian words. And they're not like the names of gods where you would borrow that because it's their culture. It's like the word for basket. Like, why would they do that if they're not influenced by Egypt? Or the tabernacle has a lot in common with Egyptian temples. Another guy I know real well, David Falk, just wrote a book on that just came out. I just actually received mine like last week. So that's where I would tell them to start. And then answer the question, why do they have all this Egyptian stuff in here if they were never in Egypt?
Right, so they've got to look at, for example, these mentions of internal evidence is what you're pointing to.
Yeah, that's where I would try to start, yeah.
Yeah, so, when you look at the internal evidence, you find that, for example, there are words like Professor Janzen just mentioned just now. And I guess also that you would find other evidences that some have pointed to, for example, the fact that they describe the making of bricks, which was unique to that period of time. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, so the brick making with a quota per day is a very New Kingdom Egypt policy. We have tons of data. I should probably explain New Kingdom for a second. The New Kingdom runs from about 1550 to 1120, 1100, 1050. You get some debate, but you get the point. It's in the centuries that would definitely be when the Exodus took place. No matter when you date it, it's in the New Kingdom. I don't know of anyone who dates it anywhere else that's taken seriously. And there are texts that talk about like expectations for workers for making bricks. And then we also have paintings like tomb scenes, like the Tomb of Rekhmire, where we see Asiatics, right? They're very distinctly Asiatic, not Egyptian, making bricks in the tomb. So it's basically just like we're told at the beginning of the book of Exodus. Other things are really interesting, like they ask for time off. Moses asked for time off to worship Yahweh and go out in the desert, right? The Egyptians actually have texts where their workers, the actual Egyptian workers, request time off for religious festivals. And so Moses is doing things that he somehow knows the Egyptians have a policy on, which would also make sense if he's really raised in the court, by the way. Like, he would be the perfect guy to know all this, which is another thing in my article for the Christian Research Journal. Right. So there's a lot of things that if you actually know the Egyptian texts, you can see some pretty interesting parallels in the book of Exodus. And that doesn't necessarily require, a ton of archaeology, but just knowing the historical texts.
Well, absolutely. And in that article, in the article you wrote on oneplace.com, you cite reasons for why atheists are asking this question, or rather skeptics, I should say, are asking this question. Not every skeptic, of course, is necessarily an atheist. But you cite 3 reasons, and you say a perceived lack of substantiating archaeological evidence from Egypt and Sinai. And then, of course, you talk about the Exodus account of you as myth or historic, or highly distorted mnemo history. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah. That basically means cultural memory that they pass down until it gets so distorted you couldn't trace it. That's kind of the idea from that sort of $10 word.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's just talk about the first one. I'll leave the third one for later, which seems to tie into the priestly source kind of argument. But the first point, you said it's a perceived lack of substantiating archaeological evidence, and you kind of hinted that earlier with regards to the argument from silence that we commonly hear. I'm just asking, what is usually driving that? Is it just a sort of a methodological skepticism that is just driving that? Or is there really, for example, less archaeological evidences for the book of Exodus in relatively to the rest of the Bible, for example?
Well, it is true that the further back you go in the biblical timeline, the more difficult it is to find like collaborative evidence. In fact, the guy I quoted on absence of evidence, he wrote the book called On the Reliability of the Old Testament, where he actually starts with the divided monarchy and works back because he makes a stronger case that way. So it is harder to get data. I can admit that. But I think there's also a couple reasons that the skeptics, they're looking for substantiating evidence for a number of reasons. One, it is good historiography to say, I have a source, can I confirm it, right? There's nothing problematic in that approach. What's problematic is expecting all this stuff of archaeology when even in places where we have really good excavations, right? We're talking about in terms of like the amount we've ever excavated of what has ever existed, like a percentage, 1%.
Wow.
Right? There's just like a phenomenal amount that will never recover or haven't yet because of damage, flooding, modern occupation, modern politics. I mean, we could go on and on. And then for the Exodus in particular, just return to that point about the Sinai as well. Like you would think, okay, if there is all these people leaving Egypt and they're in the Sinai, they should have some evidence of it. But did they really ever stop and build much?
Right.
And then again, it's not really been excavated so much as surveyed, and that doesn't probably get us deep enough to really find much. So there's that. And then I guess lastly, to kind of try to answer this without getting too long-winded,
Sure.
we have to expect the right things of the Egyptians, which is kind of the other big methodological thing here. They don't memorialize defeat, right? They're not going to be like, hey, make sure you put that on the temple wall that a bunch of our slaves left and all kinds of crazy things happened before that, right? They're not going to celebrate that. They're going to bury that as much as they can. They're not even going to mention it. I mean, Ramses loses the Battle of Kadesh, according to pretty much every historian, goes back and celebrates it like he won. He spins it. You can't expect these same people to, you know, try to do some sort of balanced, unbiased account of the Exodus for us to find all these records. I mean, what would those be? That's just not Egyptian ideology, and it's not how Egyptian monuments function. They are always celebrating Pharaoh, and this kind of defeat is not getting any press in Egypt.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that that could be said of almost all ancient civilizations as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Particularly the Romans were quite popular for damnatio. Damnato memoria, I think, was the term they would use to damn the memory of certain things. But we spoke a lot. I mean, you kind of spoke about Sinai there, and I was wondering whether you want to tackle that later or whether you want to go to that now before we start looking at the external evidence. When you talk about Sinai, there's been a lot of interest lately, particularly on YouTube, on a popular level. I'm not sure on a scholarly level whether that's the case, but there's been a lot of interest in this place in Saudi Arabia, I believe, and you know, it's this where the rock looks split, and they'd say that was the site. And I was just wondering, since you mentioned in passing Sinai, I'm just wondering what your take on that was.
I think it's very, very misinformed, unfortunately. I don't want to slam any individuals, but I think they are clearly misunderstanding what Paul means, because they're really basing that on Paul referencing the word Arabia. Mm-hmm. And they need to do more homework on what Arabia meant in Paul's day, which is a much broader range than we wouldn't call the Sinai Peninsula Arabia today, but he could. Right? That's the semantic range of the term has changed a lot. And otherwise, there's nothing to suggest they're over there. Again, that's going to be in the book on the route of the Exodus. We talk a lot about Sinai, and the best candidates are all in the southern Sinai Peninsula. When you think about travel logistics, access to water, like how far they can travel in a day, right? We're doing kind of all those kind of things. Some of it's even almost math in a way, to try to establish the most reasonable location. And they just don't have anywhere near enough time to get all the way over there. And then why would they cross another body or go around it, a body of water? I mean, and then they double back. It just doesn't work on a number of levels.
Absolutely, and that's going to be really interesting to see the development, particularly on your research on the route that they've taken. Mm-hmm. I did want to go into the external evidence as well. You mentioned earlier there's only 1% of excavations or archaeological work done in the Sinai region. And I was
even in Egypt.
Even Egypt, for that matter. I thought Egypt would have been way more than that, because that's what they thrive on.
Well, that estimate comes from, she's known as a space archaeologist, a friend of mine, Sarah Parkak, who basically has this really awesome niche where she looks at old satellite photos and enhances them, does different things with the tech that I'm not smart enough to understand. And she can identify sites. You know, if you see enough like straight lines and right angles, it's like, oh, there's a site. And she estimates that we're talking 1% have ever been excavated, because there's just so much we haven't ever gotten to. There's funding issues, of course, there's a lot of reasons. And she estimates that, you know, we're not even close to covering anything in full detail. Even like Megiddo in Israel, right, which has been dug for a century. The estimate there is maybe 3 to 5% by different scholars. So, I mean, that really is the starting point. I know it makes it sound super skeptical, and I think archaeology can do a number of wonderful things. I just want to just point out that that again gets back to having the right expectations.
Absolutely, and I think this 1%. Let's focus on that 1% then of what we've done. What are some of the more hair-raising evidences that have come out that I think Christian should be that you think rather Christian should be excited about?
Okay, so most of these are going to be sort of archaeology meets sort of the overall history when you put them together, because I think sometimes we split and there's no reason to. My favorite, let me just do my favorite two. How about that? So the Joseph story, right? What does the skeptic, let me flip it and ask you a question. What does the skeptic say for just a second about the Joseph story?
It's highly unlikely. I've not looked a lot about it, but it's highly unlikely. For example, that a slave would be elevated to that kind of status. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's against their policy. It brings down their dignity. Those kind of arguments.
Yeah, and so what we're really talking about, demonstrating that these things actually aren't far-fetched. So we don't have direct evidence of Joseph, but we do have another man whose tomb has been excavated, and they're finally starting to publish it now, named Aper-El, El being the Semitic word for God. Mm-hmm. So he's from the same area as Joseph, and he rises up to the position of vizier, and he tells us this in his tomb, right? Like, this is proof that is possible for a foreigner to reach those heights at around the same time period. So the idea that nope, can't happen because he's a foreigner, you can throw that out.
Right.
It doesn't directly prove Joseph, but it really hurts the argument they're trying to make.
Right. Okay. So that's
go
the
ahead.
First point. Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to ask you. Was that your first point on the first?
Yeah. So like even something like Joseph that forever looked too romantic and too good to be true and rags to riches, and now he's a foreigner. Well, now we know there's a foreigner who's done it.
Right.
So it's not actually impossible. That doesn't mean I have proof of Joseph, but I can counter their claim. See what I'm saying?
Right. Got it. So would you say, yeah, sorry, I just wanted to ask whether that is what you would consider one of, like, for example, the most exciting discoveries that you've had?
I think it is, because it's a tomb with that Semitic name, just like Joseph, and he's definitely ranked 2 after Pharaoh, right? Like, this is a big deal. So that one's really good for our, again, more like disarm their argument than really prove our own, but that's still important.
Right.
So, and then in terms of like direct discoveries relating to the Exodus, it's not like there's a ton, because again, there's not much going on in Sinai. Maybe we should also point out Sinai is one of the more politically unstable regions in Egypt, and it's not a great, I mean, they're not doing digs there for a lot of reasons. That's one of them. But the other thing that I find really exciting, that's not really brand new evidence, but it's something that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of and maybe hasn't gotten a ton of press. It is a point that Professor Hoffmeyer does make. And I'll return now to this irritation I have for years about the Exodus not naming Pharaoh. Like, we could be done with debating the date if it would just tell us. But that actually fits New Kingdom conventions. So in the New Kingdom, when Pharaoh sets off to battle, he usually just calls his enemy the great Weru, the great chief of whatever place. He doesn't give him a personal name. It's almost sassy. And I think the Bible's being sassy too. And so then the Bible does the same thing. Nope, he's just Pharaoh. I'm not giving you the personal name. But later, so like later, if it's written way later, by that point, the Egyptians and everybody else basically use King so-and-so of a place. Like, they give you the proper name. And so it's really interesting. And instead of it being this irritation, I'm like, oh, this is great. It sets the context as New Kingdom Egypt, just like we think. Because, and again, who would know Egyptian scribal conventions? A Moses raised in the Egyptian palace. And that'll get me to a third thing, so I lied. I have 3. And the other one I think is really important to kind of mention that I don't want to pass over is Moses being raised in the court of Pharaoh is totally in keeping with New Kingdom policy. They have a whole school of foreign princes that they're Egyptianizing so they can then send them back to rule as vassals. It's a very clever system. So that another Semitic boy, Moses, being raised there, no one would blink an eye. They've been doing that for a century or so.
And I guess that would kind of like disprove the popular perception that we see in movies, that there's only 2 guys, that were there, was Moses and his his half brother, and that in movies like Ten Commandments and all that. So that would kind of throw that out, wouldn't it?
Sometimes it's translated the royal nursery, but it's really a school to train up mostly Semitic individuals to go back home and rule the city on Egypt's behalf. So Egypt gets a ruler they like, and the people get a local, and everybody wins. Less rebellions.
Well, and of course, I've been particularly interested in the book of Daniel as well. And you find that, for example, Daniel 11 does describe the southern kingdom, or what is called the southern kingdom, Egypt, ruled by the Ptolemies in the late Greek Empire. And you find some similar things as well. They adopt people from the northern kingdom, and they use them as princes. I'm struggling to remember the names, but it seems to be a recurring practice in Egypt. Would that be fair?
Yeah, it's just good empire building, really, and they're doing it in the new kingdom when we need it to happen for Moses. And the Persians do this, right? They set up satraps to rule over locals. The satraps are Persians, but it's like they're governors, and then the mayors of the city, if you want to use modern terms, anachronistic or whatever, but it's close enough, they're locals. And so they have a chain of command. And the Egyptians are doing kind of something like that without the satraps, but they're making sure that these princes, which is kind of what they are, can go back and govern the way Egypt wants and be loyal to Egypt because they've raised them. So Moses would grow up in that context. That's also why he would know to request time off. He would know if they're being too harsh. He knows the Egyptian system.
Well, that's fantastic. And now those of you watching at home, you can spoil any movies on Moses that come out for your friends, courtesy of this interview. But
Right.
Please make sure you share the link to this interview so that the tradition of spoiling that movie goes on. So with that said, we want to talk about popular misconceptions since that was just brought up. What other popular misconceptions are there? For example, the one I just mentioned, there being only two rulers, Moses and his half brother. What other popular misconceptions are there, whether archaeological or historical, with regards to the book of Exodus and Moses?
I think probably the most important one for apologetics is understanding the numbers of Israelites coming out of Egypt.
Yeah.
And I'll just be very blunt here. I think most of our English translations are understanding the Hebrew word Eleph to mean 1,000, and then you get like 600,000 fighting men, which would probably mean like 2 million when you count women and children. And I gotta say, they could just take over Egypt, and they certainly wouldn't struggle to take over the Promised Land, which has like a population of maybe 50,000 to 70,000 at the time. But Eleph can also mean like a military leader or like a clan. And if you change that, then you get a much more believable total population. And this is really important too, because if we take it back now to Sinai, if it's more like 20 to 30,000 Israelites, well, you wouldn't expect them to leave a ton of stuff everywhere. But if it's 2 million, okay, I can see why the skeptic would be like, really? There's 2 million and there's nothing? Well, the answer is our translations get kind of their own traditions, and this word can mean a couple different things. And I think a lot of good Bibles now will put that as a footnote and note that, oh yeah, by the way, this also can mean these other things. And I think those meanings the numbers make a lot more sense. And then the other one I would point out is the Red Sea, Sea of Reeds, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Yes. But the Hebrew actually says Sea of Reeds, not the Red Sea, which is a mistranslation in the Greek Septuagint. That's really where that started. And there's still a lot of debate about this. But the area where this took place was much marshier and much wetter in ancient times. There's a lot of geology on all that. I mean, this is like really hard science. So Sea of Reeds, there's a couple different candidates like Lake Timsah or Bala Lake. It's still a substantial body of water. It's not as arid as it is today. So it doesn't really change sort of the miraculous intervention. But if you're looking for it to be the like middle of the Red Sea or something, you are definitely in the wrong place. But Sea of Reeds could mean a lot of different things.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. And so particularly, I was quite fascinated about what you said about the numbers, because that would kind of deflate most of the atheistic objection. Well, you have like 1 million plus people here. What's the evidence to substantiate that? And of course, what you are saying is not that the text is wrong, but it's that the translation may not be as accurate in understanding what the term of the Aleph is. And I'm just wondering, because you were talking about Sinai, and I was reading about parallels between, for example, New Testament and in 8 passages paralleling that of the book of Exodus. And one of the ones that I was really fascinated about was the parallel between uh, um, the day of Pentecost and that of Moses traveling to Mount Sinai,
Hmm.
where you have, for example, Moses going up and, God coming down in fire, just like the disciples are in the upper room, God comes down to them in fire. And when Moses comes down, 3,000 people die. And of course, 3,000 people get saved when the apostles in the upper room come down. Interesting parallels going on there. But in terms of numbering, you just mentioned that, for example, that when it talks about hundreds of thousands, that may be a mistranslation. Would you say when it talks about 3,000 men being killed, that would that be an accurate number, about 3,000 men being killed, or would that be, for example, a little bit more of misunderstanding the translation?
Probably the latter, yeah, which also makes God not quite so severe, I guess you could say. There's maybe some apologetic value there, depending on the skeptic. And either way, it's a tragedy. I would have to check the Hebrew to be safe, so I don't want to get locked in on that. But I can give you another example. You know what happens after in Joshua, when they go up to
Yes.
Ai, and Achan had sinned, right? And then there's like thousands of them that go up, and then like what, I can't remember off the top of my head how many are said to die. But it's like, this doesn't seem that tragic. But if it's not thousands, but leaders, and most of the leaders, okay, well, now that's tragic. You see what I mean? So
Right.
there are some other passages elsewhere in the Bible too, where if we take a different approach to the word Eleph in Hebrew, we get a bit more of a logical translation, I guess I could put it that way. And it doesn't make the Bible wrong, because the original language it's a translational issue that's fairly simple to correct.
Absolutely. And of course, those of you wondering on biblical inerrancy, we did an interview on that, and we are talking about biblical inerrancy applying to the original autograph,
Yes.
not to translations. And if those of you want to know more on biblical inerrancy, you can look up the interview we did with Dr. Wayne Grudem. You can
Hmm.
find that in the link to this video as well. Well, there's been exciting stuff here, Dr. Mark Janzen. We've spoken about the internal evidence, we've spoken about the external evidence. One of the less popular questions that come up is there's a lot of confusion with regards to Mount Paran. And some
Hmm.
people think that it's a place in Arabia. I'm just wondering, have you done any work on, for example, the location of this place uh, in terms of that? Because it seems to be quite important, especially when discussing with uh, Muslims, for example.
Yeah, I'm not going to be too much help for you there, because I stick to what is specifically on the Exodus and Numbers itinerary and not so much the later traditions. You can get information on that, though, in the Lexon Geographic Commentary volume when it comes out. I know there's going to be discussions on that there. But since I'm an Egyptologist, I usually focus on the part of the itinerary that's closer to Egypt, and I don't want to steer anyone in the wrong
Sure
direction.
thing.
So I'll reference a better scholar for that.
Well,
And
I do
better
appreciate
commentary.
that. I do
Yeah.
appreciate that. Well, before we close, one of the things I wanted to talk about was in terms of approach. Now, obviously, most people, Christians that uh, deal with this topic are not archaeologists. So, how should a Christian apologist or a Christian, a lay Christian for that matter, when facing questions about the historicity of the book of Exodus, how should they go about it?
First, you need to be informed. I think, as I don't know, I'm a Protestant, so that's really kind of churches I can speak to. I don't think most of Protestant Christendom in the United States has done a very good job of teaching the biblical backgrounds and the context, the kind of stuff we've been going through, which is why it's such a privilege to be on something like this with you. And I think it would probably apply to churches not just in the United States. So first, be informed, right? I think it's really unfortunate that sometimes I find myself thinking, this skeptic I'm talking to here has read up way more than the Christians I'm trying to teach over here. Like, my brothers, it should not be so, to paraphrase Paul here. Let's be informed. And I referenced a couple of the works coming out. There's, again, Hoffmeier's books are terrific. They're definitely academic, so I don't know if that will, people will find that intimidating, but he has such an incredible breadth of coverage that it's something, if you really want to engage in this topic seriously, you need to be familiar with. And then I would say, don't be afraid of archaeology, right? I mean, we trust the Lord then that these things aren't going to contradict a proper understanding of scripture, or as an old archaeologist said back in the middle of the 20th century, Roland DeVoe, very famous archaeologist, said a properly interpreted a biblical text and an archaeological tell will be in agreement. And so that's where we kind of can talk about the translational things too. And understand when archaeologists do is wonderful, but there are always limits in what we can actually ever get to that ever existed. And so I think most of the time it contextualizes. That's the absolute best benefit. And it can confirm sometimes things like we talked about with House of David, but it can also challenge our presuppositions. And these are all things that I think are part of loving the Lord our God with our mind. And I think sometimes we kind of want to skip that one, I think, at least in a lot of the church circles that I've been a part of. And so don't be afraid of it. Read. You got to read. I don't know how else to put it. Like, you got to read up to be able to argue well. And the skeptics are doing that.
Absolutely. And of course, this is, just a sharing on those for believers. As much as we disciple the soul, we do need to disciple the mind as well. The undiscipled mind is the fertile ground for apostasy and all sorts of heresies to spring about. And while we do hear about lots of Christians saying, well, all I have is just a childlike faith, that's good. A childlike faith is an inquisitive faith, a faith that seeks to get more information, to grow. But that is not to be confused with a childish faith. It just refuses to grow, and just doesn't want to look at the evidence, stuck in its own way.
My 6-year-old, she asks great questions, like she's not simple about it. Another thing I thought would be good to mention as a sort of another resource for people, you mentioned it's unfortunate that Southwestern closed down their archaeology, but the two main professors there are actually at Lipscomb University now at the Lanier Center for Archaeology, which they just started this semester. And it's going to be a really awesome place, a great website to keep an eye on, to check out for resources or, even MA programs and things like that. So just another thing for people to be aware of, because I think if we're not careful, evangelicals and Protestants, we're going to lose the archaeological battle. And it's really important that we support guys like Dr. Davis and Dr. Ortiz, who are fighting in the trenches. And Lanier Center for Archaeology at Lipscomb is definitely something that your viewers, I think, will want to keep an eye on.
Well, absolutely. And we'll try to keep the links to all of this in the description box. And that was quite profound, what Dr. Mark Janzen just pointed out. And that is that, we don't want to lose the battle on archaeology. We know, for example, in the scientific enterprise, we've kind of like waved the white flag there. Philosophically, in the last 50 years or so, we've seen a revival in terms of the philosophical department.
I'm hoping science catches up to philosophy, because
absolutely, we've had Alvin Fleninger, Richard Swinburne, doing really well and fighting the battle in the philosophical side. But yeah, you're absolutely. I would just like to let you continue what you were saying there, Dr. Janzen.
Yeah, we don't want to have what has happened in at least like biology, at least, or something, to happen to archaeology. And there's only a few evangelical programs, so it was kind of heartbreaking when Southwestern closed theirs. And then I was relieved when Lipscomb and Mark Lanier and the Lanier Center stepped up to the plate. And now it's basically the same things that were happening at Southwestern are now at Lipscomb. And they're doing archaeology for Old Testament time period, New Testament time period. I mean, it's going to be wonderful for the Christian apologist who's sensitive to archaeology being one of the fulcrums for these discussions. So just a good shout out to them is, I think, very necessary.
Absolutely. And one final question we do have before we wrap this interview up. It's the question of not just how should Christians respond, but what elements of Christ and the gospel can we find from a historical and archaeological study of the book of Exodus?
Well, I think the first thing is really simple. This is the Bible's version of Israelite origins that everyone who matters for our faith that existed, right, all that history, especially Jesus, considered to be truth, right? I mean, the Exodus is referenced more than any single event in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, of course. Yeah. And so the stakes are high there. And I think understanding the complexity of it can be good for us in terms of spiritual formation and keeping us humble and appreciating the God who not only delivered them, but is the God, the master of history. And I know that may seem corny to some people, but I think whenever I really deep dive and I'm like, man, there's so many complex issues, I'm reminded just how fallen and finite my knowledge is compared to God's. And it fills me with a sense of awe and trust in his plan. And I think if we lose the battle for people like Moses and David, and you already know this from the Jesus seminar coming after Jesus, of course, right? These are all people that Christ himself considered historical. And I think part of loving our neighbor should actually extend to people in the past and making sure we understand the world they lived in, the context they live in, and defend what they accomplished when it comes to someone like Moses or David, who I keep using as the sort of two examples, but you could do Daniel, whoever.
Right.
And so I think we're almost obligated to keep ourselves informed and to be on the forefront of these discussions as a way of showing the plausibility of Christianity, which is unique among most of the world religions. Judaism would share this, of course, and to some extent Islam, in that it is a religion that claims historical propositions. It's not transcendental, right? And so this is, I think, extremely important for us when we realize all that.
Well, absolutely. This has been an enjoyable interview, and I'm really grateful to Dr. Mark Janzen for this. One final question on, if you're interested to know more about where you can find him, not just the latest books that he's working on, but where you can find his own material. Dr. Janzen, could you advise us on how we could read more about your work, as not just your books?
Yeah, so I am out, we mentioned the Swivitz connection, but I'm also assistant professor now of history at Louisiana College, so you can find me there. I have the usual Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff. As far as where I post the most, I'm probably more active on Facebook than the others, but obviously, you know, you've got the usual run of websites, and it's just Janzen with a Z. That's the thing that throws people off. Or I try to get back to people quickly with emails, which I don't mind sharing that. mjansen7@gmail.com is probably the best one to use there. But thank you for the opportunity to mention that.
Absolutely. And this has been, again, a joy. Really grateful, Dr. Janzen, that you were able to join us.
Thanks for having me.
And those of you watching at home, we hope that you've enjoyed this interview. If you did, feel free to like, share, and if you're not already subscribed to Explain Apologetics, please feel free to hit that red button right there and hit the bell to be notified the next time we go live. We do have more exciting interviews coming up, including an interview with another professor from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, Dr. Ted Cable, will be coming up pretty soon to discuss the age of the earth controversy, whether Christians should divide over the age of the earth controversy. That's going to be a controversial one, no pun intended. But till next time, I'm Samuel Nason. On behalf of everyone on Explain Apologetics team and Dr. Mark Janzen, thank you for joining us. Bye for now.